So how did you connect the dots for this?
That's a good question. So it was actually my co-founders and I. So there's three of us in the company: myself, Joshua Glovin, and Aaron Levy. And so we were on a walk one day in a local park in Berkeley that actually used to be a landfill, and they've covered it with grass, and it's a nice place to play with dogs. But there's this big sort of industrial looking smokestack right in the middle of the landfill. And, we never really noticed it before. We got a little bit closer and we realized that they were actually burning off the methane in the landfill. And this landfill was closed in the 70s, and it's still producing methane today. And so here is this old landfill that has, $1 million piece of capital equipment sitting on with, several, $100,000 worth of maintenance per year, that just for the purpose of burning off the methane. Okay. And so we realized that, putting two and two together, being, involved with Bitcoin, understanding Bitcoin mining. So we also founded a small Bitcoin mining company that does syndication. So we bring retail investors together and pool resources and put them into co-location facilities. And so we knew, we were familiar with Bitcoin mining. We had a lot of partners in the space. And so putting two and two together, landfill methane was, this cheap and wasted energy source that, we could capitalize with Bitcoin mining.
Can you explain to me the business of landfills themselves outside of Bitcoin mining? How do they work? How do they choose a site? How long do they last for? How do they cover them?
That's a great question. So landfills, or, I guess the full name would be a municipal solid waste landfill. And so in the United States, there's about 2,600 landfills. Of those landfills, about 30% of them 30% of those landfills have active projects on them. And when I say projects, I mean that they are, there's a power plant that's burning the methane and selling the power to the grid, or they are refining the methane into natural gas and then piping it into the pipeline. So these two project types are very capital intensive and are not scalable. So they only really pencil out for larger landfills that are located close into cities, right? So that leaves about 2,000 landfills that are not doing anything with the methane that they produce. And a landfill, by definition, produces methane because as garbage goes into the landfill, that garbage is decomposing, and part of the decomposition process produces methane. So 2,000 landfills aren't doing anything with the methane. 30% of that 2,000 are flaring it because they're required to by the EPA. And the remaining 70% of them are just freely emitting into the atmosphere. So both of these sort of cohorts of landfills provides, that these are our customers. So these are landfills that are remote and decentralized, and generally speaking, farther away from city centers, such that a traditional project doesn't make sense. So, when you're running a traditional project, let's look at the power plant example. With a power plant, you have to, produce electrons on the site and then transfer those electrons off to where they're being used. So that requires infrastructure. And, power transmission infrastructure can cost anywhere from $1 to $3 million a mile. So the second one would be refining to natural gas and sending it to your stove or whatever else is using natural gas, and that also requires transfer of physical things. So in the power transmission case, you're transmitting electrons. In the gas refining case, you're transmitting molecules. Whereas in our case, we're by virtue of Bitcoin mining, we're transmitting data, and data can be transmitted, anywhere in the world using a satellite uplink.
Okay, so of those, was it 3,200 or 2,600?
So 2,600 landfills.
Yeah.
About 600 of them have an active project.
Okay.
So that leaves 2,000 landfills with nothing happening on them.
And those active projects tend to be ones with just well-funded cities. They can afford to do it.
Well, there would be things like let's take Los Angeles, for example, large city, big population center. So they produce enough trash to build a 30 megawatt power plant. And so the economics work because the selling power is a very low margin business. So you need a lot of power to actually make it pencil out, right? So, and not only that, when you're hooking up a power plant, there's a 2 to 4 year window that you have to work with the utility to get permits and get set up. So it's a very long and arduous process. So for these smaller and medium-sized landfills, it just doesn't pencil out. So there's no way for these landfills to monetize their methane assets, essentially.
And those ones with power plants, they're generating all the power from the landfill.
That's correct. Mm-hmm.
And just from the methane,
just from the methane.
They don't burn off any of the trash or anything?
Nope, just from the methane. Yeah.
Wow.
So they call it's called a landfill because trash gets filled in. It's essentially buried underground. And when it gets buried underground, it's essentially in an anaerobic environment. And in an anaerobic environment, that's where the methane gets produced.
Do they line these massive pits?
They do. So they line them with liners, and they put so a landfill is split up into different cells. And after they finish a cell, they'll sort of cover it over with a liner, move on to the next cell. And then when landfills are constructed, they're generally constructed with a series of piping underneath. That's called a GCCS, or a gas collection and control system, and that's what actually allows the methane to flow up into a pipe and then either get flared or, in our case, put into a generator.
Okay, so the ones that are flaring,
mm-hmm.
they're flaring because of specific rules. Explain why they flare it.
So the EPA.
Explain who the EPA is to people not from the US.
Of course, EPA is the US Environmental Protection Agency.
Okay.
So they have basically a set of standards, guidelines for landfills to mitigate their methane emissions. So the EPA generally, they regulate how much methane can get produced from a landfill. And so historically, the EPA has relied on states to sort of self-police their methane emissions. Okay, and so as a result, a lot of states take a more lax stance to how much methane is flared or how much methane is released. And so at the end of 2021, the EPA released a new set of standards called the NSPS, the New Source Performance Standards. And these standards say that now the states are no longer in charge of their landfills, and the EPA, the federal EPA, now has jurisdiction over all state landfills. And so as a result, essentially all landfills by 2025 are going to have to install this gas capture and flaring system and start flaring their methane. And so this constitutes more than 1,000 landfills that are going to have to expend actual resources at taxpayer expense to capture and flare their methane because of environmental regulations.
What kind of cost would that be?
That would be on the order of several $1 million per landfill.
Wow.
So
okay.
it's a major expenditure. And when you're looking at some of these communities, these are places that don't have a lot of income coming in from other sources. And so now if you're asking somebody to come up with another $3 million and another several $100,000 a year just to upkeep the facility, that's a major expense that, is generally going to be passed down to taxpayers, unfortunately. So that provides that represents a cohort of landfills that has a very clear value proposition from the way that we would partner with them. And
a municipality is what? A collection of towns?
Yeah, a municipality would be generally a county.
A county.
Yep.
Okay.
So a county. Our first pilot site in California is going to be a county-run site in Central California.
But do some counties share?
Generally speaking, a county would have its own landfills under its jurisdiction.
Oh wow!
So they're very decentralized. So that's why it's if they were centralized and all of the trash went into kind of one place, then you could more easily and economically build a power plant or a gas processing. But because there's 2,600 landfills scattered across the U.S. into this remote and decentralized grid, it only makes sense from a traditional perspective to do the large ones.
And flaring is because?
Yeah, flaring is because so methane is a terrible greenhouse gas.
Okay.
So methane, when compared to carbon dioxide, is about 84 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. And so there's a massive environmental sort of reason or impetus for burning that methane. So
because if you burn it off, you just create carbon dioxide.
Correct. So burning it off is essentially 84 times better than letting it emit, right? And so the EPA, or the United States, is taking a stance that they're going to try to regulate their way out of methane emissions. And so that we often say that the EPA takes a stick approach to methane mitigation, whereas we provide a carrot approach. And the United States has one of the strongest environmental regulatory agencies of any country on the planet. So even if the U.S. does manage to regulate its way out of methane emissions, it doesn't really set a very good model for the rest of the world. So our mission is to set up a model that not only works in the United States, but we can scale out to any landfill across the globe.
This is a global issue.
This is definitely a global issue. I mean, land or methane in general, and mitigating methane is the strongest lever that we have as humanity to curb climate change.
Do we know what percentage of emissions, accounting for the fact that it's 84 times worse, how big an issue methane is? Because the majority of the conversation is centered on carbon dioxide. It's not on methane.
Correct.
You occasionally hear about it, but
right.
How big? Do we know what percentage it is?
I mean, methane is a huge issue, and that if we were able, so again, and this is actually the UN put out a big report at the end of last year. There was a big conference in Glasgow about curbing methane emissions, and so if we managed to curb methane emissions, like all methane emissions globally today, we would have a very good chance of meeting the 1.5 degrees Celsius climate goals. So there's it represents the fastest and easiest way to get to make a significant impact on climate change.
And the methane comes from landfill sites around the world, but where else do we know where else?
Yeah, so methane. There's sort of three major sources of human-caused methane. So one is oil and gas exploration, and there's a number of really great companies that are working in that space to address that issue. The second one is in agriculture and animal husbandry. So this includes things like dairies and pig farming and things like this, and also other agricultural uses like rum distilleries or in palm oil processing. And then landfills is at least globally is the third biggest emitter. However, that's based on self-reported data. And there's recently been a NASA survey of U.S. landfills that said that the reported data is actually underreported by a factor of 2 to 3x. So landfills
just in the U.S.
And so landfills represent a much bigger problem than is sort of currently, talked about.
And I imagine other countries in the world, maybe South American, Brazil, perhaps India, Indonesia, some of these countries who don't have the same regulatory bodies and the same economic position as the US. Their landfill sites aren't built in the same way, constructed in the same way, aren't perhaps even flaring. It's a bigger problem in developing countries, I can imagine.
You're absolutely right. And this, our mission is to, so the United States is obviously the leader in a lot of aspects, but also, our main goal is to set up shop in the U.S. Under a stable regulatory regime. Help to change the narrative surrounding Bitcoin mining. And we do that by, again, partnering with local municipalities and changing that sort of viewpoint on a grassroots level. And then creating a model that we can then roll out to other jurisdictions internationally and worldwide. And that not only encompasses landfills, but also other sources of methane like dairies and palm oil processing.
So can you bypass the New York moratorium?
Yes, absolutely. So So our solution is so my understanding of the New York moratorium is that it only focuses on new Bitcoin mining using coal or other fossil fuels.
Which is a weird question, because if you're buying off the grid, how do you know? Can you say to the grid, I only want your energy from renewables?
Yeah, that's a great question. But from our perspective, not only is our energy renewable, it's actually carbon negative. And you can very sort of scalably and measurably show exactly how much carbon is removed or is mitigated by, or what they call it, carbon dioxide equivalent. So by building one Vespene module, and we call modules, basically a small landfill can fit one module, which is about 1.5 megawatts.
What is a module? Is it a container?
Yeah, so it would be a container full of miners and a generator.
And how many ASICs in that?
There would be about 400 ASICs.
400 ASICs in one module with a generator. Okay.
Yep. And so that module can mitigate so if you there's various calculators that can show you carbon dioxide equivalencies and how much, say, cars can come off the road or how many houses emissions are dealt with. But the one that we like is how many trees can you plant with the equivalent.
Because it's a bigger number.
Well, so you could either mine Bitcoin on one small landfill for a year, or you could plant 5 million trees and let them grow for 10 years. Both of those are going to have the same environmental impact.